In the UK, the problem of nightmare neighbours has never been worse.
Oi, you were assaulting me.
I was shaking. I was absolutely terrified.
1 in 5 of us has been at war with next door.
Never forget that, scumbag.
Where flaring tempers can turn home life into a living hell.
We dread coming home.
Coming up, it's war on 2 fronts in Sheffield.
He was hacking down with the knife.
A couple in Cardiff meet a nightmare neighbour.
I walked to the kitchen and I saw him soaking in a petrol.
And a garden dispute in Brighton turns violent.
This fist came out and punched me right in the neck.
"69-year-old Rod Scott is retired and lives in the small area of mill houses on the edge of Sheffield.
I've been here since '78, and as you can see, I like my gardening.
Rod lived peacefully in the area for more than 20 years, until in 2002, a new family moved in next door.
I was just watching TV, then there was a large banging on the door, and it was really 11:30 at night. Who is this? I came out into the hallway, got to the door, and there was a woman standing there, and she said to me, "My name is Mrs. Hall, and this is my husband, Bob, and we're the new neighbours, and we thought we'd just come round and see what the neighbours were like." It was obvious they'd been in the pub drinking. Fair dues, they introduced themselves, but I think in anybody's book, it's not the right time of the day to knock on somebody's door and introduce yourself.
Aside from this incident, which the Halls deny, the neighbours initially lived in peace. But all that changed one day in 2006.
I was working in my garden all day, and I was playing this Pavarotti tape, and I heard this voice screaming and shouting, "Rod, Rod, Rod!" And I walked out to see Hall storming down his driveway. The first thing he said was, "Turn that thing off. Don't take the piss out of me. I will sort you out." So I just stood here rather shocked, wondering what had got into him. So I phoned the police and I asked them could they have a word in his ear, and explained that he couldn't conduct himself like this in the community and nip it in the bud. And I think that was the biggest mistake, because after that, it just grew out of all proportion.
Rod and the Halls fell back into an uneasy truce, but it wouldn't be long before that changed.
One morning I heard a noise and looked out, and a chap was on a ladder, and he was fixing a camera on the side that was looking directly into my house. And then they put 2 more cameras on the front of the house.
The Halls say they installed CCTV on police advice, but Rod was convinced they were watching him.
A friend of mine suggested to get a little laser, and I was in the kitchen. I pointed it at that camera. He did say that if shine it in and it could damage the cells. And as the camera was pointing straight into my house, I thought I had kind of had the right to disarm it. I think it was the laser beam that eventually persuaded Mr. Hall to take it down.
Rod thought he had left conflict behind him. He'd spent his career in the armed forces and served 15 years as a paratrooper, until an accident shattered his back, leaving it held together by plates and screws, and Rod retired. But a peaceful retirement seemed a long way off.
Mrs. Hall used to have a camcorder, and here is a photograph of her with the camcorder. She used to hold up signs that said paedophile, twat, wanker, paranormal written on it.
Mrs. Hall claims she was videoing Rod's unreasonable behaviour. Rod says he'd done nothing wrong, but one summer evening things came to a head.
It was nearly midnight. I was working in my garage, just tidying up a little. I got to about here, there was a flash of light, And Mr. Hall was leaning round the panels that were down the side of the fence with a camera, and he shouted, "Gotcha!" And I'd been working in my garage all night long, just tidying up a little. There was no noise, never was any noise, and there was no way they could hear me, not with the road traffic, and that's what I had to put up with.
The Halls have denied this event took place, but the next morning, Rod got a shock visit.
2 police officers came into my kitchen and they produced this.
Coming up, Rod's neighbours get violent.
He raised his right arm and he was holding the carving knife.
And 2 Brighton residents go to war over a path.
I stayed there for 9 hours on the lies she told.
In Brighton, Wendy Attenborough moved into a ground floor council flat after living overseas.
Quite a lot of them in the street came up and introduced themselves and asked me who I was. They always asked the same question, was, have you met your new neighbour yet? And so that put me on red alert.
76-year-old George Brooker owned the flat directly above Wendy.
Brightonian all my life. I was married 13 years. Then we got divorced and I moved here. Yeah, I've been living in the road 30 years. It's quite nice, it's nice and quiet.
It wasn't long before Wendy and George met for the first time.
I was in the back garden, he walked down the garden towards me, and I do try not to judge a book by its cover, as it were, but he sort of hugged towards me, just had an aura of aggression.
Bad aura?
He just introduced himself and went straight into complaining about the government and the council. It was just all negative, completely negative. So I just said, you know, I'm busy, and excused myself, kind of, and he wandered back up the garden. So my heart kind of sank.
Despite her initial impressions, the new neighbours had a friendly relationship at first.
Well, we used to talk, one thing and another. We used to, if the dustman had been, I used to bring her bin in and she used to bring mine in. And we turned round and we used to get on all right.
As part of her tenancy, Wendy had the use of one garden at the front of the property and another at the rear. Mr. Brooker upstairs owns a separate garden that runs around one side of the property. But within weeks of moving in, Wendy started to feel an unsettling presence from over the fence.
If I was sitting on my lounge at night, he would just come and stand by the fence and look in at me in the lounge. I was really creeped out by it.
Because Wendy's flat was on the ground floor, it offered little privacy from Mr. Brooker's garden. But it wasn't just through the windows that Wendy felt her upstairs neighbour exerting his presence.
He was mirroring what I do. You know, if I started hoovering, he'd start hoovering. If I got up, he would get up. I could hear him in his bedroom.
This is a wooden floor, right? And unfortunately, there's not much insulation in there between the ceiling downstairs and the floor here.
If I went to the bathroom or I had a shower, he would flush the toilet. He would try and assert his presence by noise.
How would I know she's in the toilet when I'm up here and she's down there? Load of rubbish. Load of rubbish. She must sit there, think about these things, but I don't. I don't interfere with anybody else up around here.
But when Wendy started putting expensive ornaments and plants on the pathway leading to her front door and garden, the troubles really began to escalate.
I started finding things had been broken. I had 2 garden gnomes that were broken. Plants had been moved around in their pots. There was no explanation why these things had been broken, and I knew it was him just smashing things.
The gnome what she put there, right? Unfortunately, the wind blew the gnome onto the path, which as you could see there, had a drop of about a foot. So that's where it broke. I didn't break it.
Because the path around the property gave access to her front door, Wendy assumed it was shared between the two flats.
There'd been no grumbles from him when I'd been taking care of the path, which was very unkempt and full of weed for like a year and a half, because I thought the path was a communal path.
But Wendy was wrong.
The whole lot of the communal way to her fence is mine. My lease states that in blue.
About a year and a half after I'd been there, I suddenly heard the path was his.
Despite the simmering tension, Wendy had big plans for her home.
After I'd been in the flat a year, I got my secure tenancy, so I decided then that was the right time to ask for permission to put up a 6-foot fence, which would stop him being able to look in at me and give me some more privacy. I got the fence put up, and this was the start of really some serious harassment. The first night, woke up in the morning and one of the posts had been pulled out of the concrete.
Well, I pulled it out because it was in my property. That is trespass.
Although she thought this small piece of land was hers, it wasn't. According to the land registry, Wendy's new 6-foot fence encroached into Mr. Brooker's garden. And this simple mistake would have huge consequences.
The next thing I knew, this fist came out and punched me right in the neck.
In Sheffield, Rod Scott had been living peacefully for over 20 years until an argument with his new neighbours, the Halls, landed him in hot water.
2 police officers came into my kitchen and they produced this. And I asked him what the form was about, and he said it was a harassment first course of conduct. The allegations were the fact that I was shaking the fence separating the properties, that I was making loud noises at night up to the time of midnight, also for verbal abuse. None of these were true.
Following the harassment warning, Rod tried to keep away from the Halls. But that wouldn't last long. One night in June 2008, Rod was saying goodbye to his friend Ian outside when the row with his neighbours was suddenly reignited in explosive fashion.
Ian had gone round to his side to get into drive, and that's when I saw him looking, and I looked, and there was Mrs. Hall, giving us nasty hand signals. Ian was looking, and I said to him, that's what I'm having to put up with day in, day out. Within a few seconds, Hall had come out of his house. He came straight across the pavement, went round to the other side of the car, whereupon he put his arm around Ian's neck in this manner and screamed at him, I will have you, you bastard. I was standing on this side. I shouted at Hall, don't be so stupid, get back in your house. And Hall came up, he just swung a wild punch and caught me bang in the ear. He knocked my spectacles off, they finished up somewhere down there. I did manage to, with an outstretched arm, I struck out for his eyes in this manner because I've got fairly long arms to keep him at arm's length.
But Rod's self-defence tactic appeared to anger Mr. Hall even further.
I saw Hall walk across the grass and he went up to the door, and then within a second or so he was walking back down again, and it wasn't until he got into the middle of the grass did I see that he raised his right arm and he was holding the carving knife. He was hacking down with the knife, and the knife came down and just went between my fingers.
Witnesses had seen the fight and the police were called. They arrived and arrested Mr. Hall. But as he was being taken away, his wife had a few final words for Rod.
Mrs. Hall shouted at them, this man's called me a gypsy. And then she immediately shouted, I put a gypsy curse on you. And with her hands held up in the air, she said, I curse you, I curse you, I curse you. She just carried on saying it. And eventually the police officer just said to me, go back in your house. And as I backed over the road, the curse must have been working because I tripped over my shoelace.
Mrs. Hall denies putting a curse on Rod, but Mr. Hall was charged with common assault and bailed. While Rod awaited Mr. Hall's trial, he kept himself busy in his garden. But this triggered a whole new set of problems when his neighbours at the rear, close friends of Mr. Hall, took issue with the new summer house Rod was erecting and accused him of building a sniper tower. Rod says they took every opportunity to provoke him.
They used to come down behind the hedges, give me verbal abuse, and they do nothing but take photographs. I then spoke to this lady, her husband, who was very cavalier with a statement that I was a scumbag. So I said to this lady, tell your husband that if he ever calls me a scumbag again, I will rip his head off and shit in the hole. That's a kind of a military expression, which means I'll come down on you.
Because of his outburst to the neighbours at the rear, Rod was arrested and hit with a restraining order. This prevented him from accessing their road or communicating with them in any way. But for Rod, this was easier said than done.
I put a sign up. I was arrested for the sign, and the other breach was an individual came over the top of the fence, and I was arrested for communicating with him.
Rod was charged with breaching his restraining order and awaited trial, but events were about to spiral out of control. Just outside Cardiff, Peter and Marjana Knapp had moved to the UK from Poland to start a family and bought their dream home in rural Wales.
Actually, we were looking for a 3-bedroom house and with a garden, with a beautiful garden, and we found it, so we were really pleased.
Very friendly people, very friendly atmosphere, like village.
Their new community was extremely close-knit, according to local hairdresser Christine Evans.
The community spirit is brilliant. If anything goes wrong, everybody sort of comes together and we all help each other. And that's one good thing about this place, to be honest.
And they were welcomed by the residents, including shop owner Lee Coles.
Peter and Marjana were really nice people. They came in, they were polite, they introduced themselves as neighbours if there's anything they can do to help, and vice versa, we told them the same. They were very outgoing, nice people.
But not all the neighbours were so friendly.
So it was the first day that we were moving in when suddenly the man appears across the hedge. And he just asked me, so how many people is going to live here? Well, I thought anyway that it was rude, but I said, well, at the moment, 2. And he said, what do you mean 2? I found it awkward, to be honest, because it's not normal. You know, when you meet a person for the first time, usually you introduce yourself, or maybe would you like some kind of help?
The man Marjana had met was 55-year-old Charles Gilbert, a well-known figure in the neighbourhood.
Yeah, I know Charles. He used to come in now and again. He used to go to my mum was a hairdresser's next door. Unfortunately, he wasn't allowed in these 2 shops because he was racist and kind of sexist. Not a very nice chap, no, to be honest.
He was a very strange character, very, very strange. One you'd have to be a bit careful about. I felt a bit uneasy around him then. That's the words I have to describe myself, that I would be very cautious around him. He made me feel very uneasy.
And unfortunately for Marjana and Peter, Charles was their next-door neighbour. And within 2 days, trouble started.
I found a lot of cigarette ends here. I found a lot of can and empty bottle of cider, and I found some bottle of cider here.
As well as the stuff on the hedge, there were 2 cans left somewhere on the grass here. One was after rice pudding and another one was Tesco beans. The stuff, it didn't belong to us at all, so someone must have thrown it into our garden.
After clearing the rubbish away, they were baffled to wake up the next day to find yet more waste scattered on their property.
We started to realize that it was actually like a puzzle, that there was some stuff left in our rear garden and then in our front garden, something left on the hedge. We just saw that, you know, it couldn't be left by someone from the outside, and it must have been Charles.
Believing they knew where it had come from, the Knapps decided to confront their next-door neighbour.
We asked him why he keeps throwing the rubbish into our garden, and he said, because you're noisy. So I said, why you haven't came and knocked to our door and said this? Guys, you know, you're a bit noisy, can you just be quiet, please? He said something like, you Poles, get back to Poland, get back to Poland. And we're like, really shocked.
Baffled by the incident, but determined to enjoy their new home, the Knaps decided to build a conservatory.
When I bring my conservatory from the van, I saw Charles and he asked me what is my plan. I tell him I will build my conservatory in my garden.
But Charles was far from happy about the new construction.
He said to Peter that if Peter's going to build up anything in our own garden, he's going to explode it.
Explode it?
Explode it.
For the Knaps, this was just the beginning of their nightmare. Coming up, the Knaps get the shock of their lives.
I walked to the kitchen and I saw him soaking in a petrol.
And Rod Scott gets some new troublesome neighbours.
Right, well, there we have one of Mr. Hall's best bred rats.
If your home life is sometimes a bit of a nightmare, our competition could really make a difference. We've got £10,000 to give away. Imagine what you could do with 10 grand. Maybe you could take the family away for a well-deserved holiday. Or perhaps it's time to spruce up your home and reclaim the garden from the wilderness. Whatever it is you need, Channel 5 wants to give you a helping hand. So for your chance to win, call 0904 161 9955 or text WIN to 85545 or post your name and phone number to WIN, PO Box 7557, Derby, DE1 0NP. Calls cost £1.53 from a BT landline. Calls from other landlines and mobiles may cost considerably more. Text costs £1.50 plus one message at standard network rate. Lines close at midday on the date shown on screen and 3 days later for postal entries. For rules, go to channel5.com/win. In Brighton, a new 6-foot fence erected by Wendy Attenborough had angered her upstairs neighbour, George Brooker. According to land registry documents, the gate of Wendy's new fence had encroached onto Mr. Brooker's land.
Oh, he would go out and punch the gate and the fence and saying, "That's my property."
One day, when Wendy was tending to plants on the pathway leading to her garden, the situation turned ugly.
It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and I was just packing up and out he comes and he starts pulling out my flowers that I'd planted. Then he started moving his chain link fence right up to the path, so it was only a matter of about 6 inches. I was just asking him to please stop because I didn't know what he was doing and he wouldn't explain anything.
But Mr. Brooker recalls events very differently.
The I remember about the day is the mere fact is she was pulling my chain link fence out the ground.
The next thing I knew, this fist came out and punched me right in the neck.
No, I didn't strike her in any way, shape or form.
And I just screamed, Paul, who's my neighbour, he's just hit me. And he'd got one of the metal stakes that was holding his chain link fence together and he held it right up to the neck and it's got my neck, it's got a really sharp point on the end. He was just like this.
And then she got on her phone and she screamed and shouted her mouth off that I was hitting her.
The police came, they said that if I wanted to take it further, they have to arrest both of us. And I'd never been arrested or in trouble with the police in my life, so I backed off with that. But in hindsight, I wish I had said, yes, arrest us both, so I could have got to the bottom of it.
Nobody saw any blood on her. So I would have thought if that was the case, she would have showed it to the police officer, because there was 2 there. and then I would have always been arrested at the time.
The police took no further action. But according to Wendy, Mr. Brooker's behaviour suddenly took a more sinister turn.
For example, I would be out there mowing the front lawn. I could hear him taking photos, the snaps of a camera, so he started taking photos of me and just doing anything to harass me.
The basis of that was she told me that she had a nasty car accident and she couldn't bend because she had a back problem. Well, to me, that's another lie, because the photographs I did take, it just showed her bending down, and when her clothes at the back pulled up, you could see her back. And if the person can push a fly mow with one hand, I don't think there's much wrong with a person's back.
Wendy says she reported some of Mr. Brooker's alleged harassment to the council, but no action was taken. Meanwhile, Mr. Brooker decided to reinstate his boundary by hand.
So what I did, I measured 3 feet, put a chalk mark in with an arrow, and what happened was, when it rained, it blew the chalk mark away, so I painted it in. And she's saying, because I painted it over to her, underneath where the cat was going in, it's her property, it's not her property, it's still mine. She is the trespasser, not me.
But Wendy Attenborough had had enough. And it wasn't long before she declared all-out war. Peter and Marjana Knapp had recently moved to a quiet suburb of Cardiff. However, their neighbour Charles Gilbert had made life difficult from day one, leaving rubbish in their garden and threatening to blow up a new conservatory they were building. Despite their neighbour's objections, Peter and his friend went ahead with the new construction. But then they noticed something alarming.
When my friend waiting in the van, I asked him, "Do you smell petrol?" My friend said, "Yes, I smell petrol. Maybe this is, do you have some leak?" Yes. And he asked me, "Are you crazy? My van is new."
Petrol was exactly what he'd smelt, and it wasn't coming from his friend's van.
I continue collection my stuff from the van, and when I came back to the house, I feel everywhere some liquid, yes, strange liquid, strange smell. I frozen because I didn't know what's happened exactly. I closed my eye and quickly came back to the house. When I come in, I wash my eyes, face, everything. I didn't know what happened exactly.
When I heard Peter was calling me, so I just came out. I walked to the kitchen and I saw him soaking in a petrol. So I asked him, what has happened? And he just told me that the neighbor put petrol over him. I was shocked. I just didn't know what to think about it at all. And he asked me to call the police.
Whilst Marjana was upstairs on the phone to the police, she heard a commotion going on downstairs.
He heard some voice getting out from the rear garden, so he went to check it out. He noticed that Charles was standing in the rear garden with a lit match. And then he quickly shut the door.
Completely crazy guy, completely.
The Knapps locked all the doors and waited anxiously for the police to arrive.
Well, we felt it basically like rats in a cage in our own house, which was really ridiculous, and the time was passing very slowly while we've been waiting for the police. The police came after about 40 minutes, so it was a long time anyway.
But when the police turned up, Charles Gilbert was nowhere to be seen.
They tried to arrest Charles. They've been knocking to his door. They tried to go through our rear garden into his garden. and there was no movement that anyone was there.
After a fruitless search, they gave up and promised to return the next day. But the Knapps were in for a terrifying night.
When the police have gone, we were scared. Charles might have been everywhere, and we were afraid that he could even explode our house. We were listening to, every single noise around. We were checking whether Charles could be somewhere around. We were also afraid that he could break into our house and just kill us. Do anything else I even can't imagine.
The next day, Charles was spotted in his house by another neighbour, and the police soon had his property surrounded.
Some of the policemen were waiting for Charles into his rear garden. Some of them were banging into the front door. And the neighbours ensured them that Charles is definitely in the house. So they just forced the door and they enter and they cuff him.
Charles Gilbert was arrested and placed on bail, but unsure if he'd return to the property, the Knapps were still living in fear.
For about either 24, 48 hours or maybe 3 days, we were still not sure what's going to happen, whether he will be allowed to go back home or not. And if he does, then he could just kill us.
And the stress started to take its toll.
I didn't go to work about 2-3 weeks because I couldn't sleep. I think all the time about the situation, how my life will be here, because I think about baby. But this situation, it was completely a shock for us.
I was scared. Since then, I think for a very long time, we did not feel safe into our own house.
In January 2014, Charles Gilbert was tried and found guilty of racially aggravated common assault and sentenced to 16 months imprisonment and a 10-year restraining order.
I think that something should have happened a while ago. It was like the eruption waiting to come then, if you know what I mean.
He's sort of outcast now because you can't do that, no matter what. They're a part of our community, they live here, they do the same as everybody else, look after the street.
But I was extremely happy and I rang my husband straight away. Because, in that way it means that we can stay in the house and we can lead a normal life.
In Sheffield, ex-paratrooper Rod Scott had fallen out with all his neighbours. His next-door neighbour, Mr. Hall, was on bail for attacking Rod with a knife. But Rod himself wasn't squeaky clean. He had a restraining order issued against him by his other neighbours. Although banned from communicating with them, Rod had been putting up threatening signs and had made gestures and shouted over the fence.
I put a sign up. I was arrested for the sign, and the other breach was an individual came over the top of the fence, and I was arrested for communicating with him. And the other one, there were some builders on the house next door, and I asked them if they would just bear witness to the harassments that I was getting from this neighbour, and I was arrested for that.
Rod was charged and found guilty of breaching his restraining order with his threatening behaviour and was sentenced to 4 months in jail, suspended for 18 months. After that, he kept himself to himself till some new neighbours arrived.
One evening, I was here with my friend Ian, and I saw him look up and he said, "Look at that." And we turned round and all I could see were little rats all running up into the bird feeder. And it was obvious that there was a nest somewhere.
Pretty soon, the rats were all over the neighbourhood. And as Rod was the first to spot them, everyone thought they were breeding in his garden. But Rod thought differently.
Next door here, where you see the 2 kitchen extensions, there was a pipe going into the wall, and there was a hole there. And the rats were going up there, getting into the cavity walls, and then eventually getting into the houses through the cavities. I was also getting them. I could lie in bed, and I could hear them running around upstairs. It was obvious they were all coming from next door from the Hall's residence, and that's what we had to look into.
Convinced he knew the culprit, Rod decided on a line of defence.
I had a rat trap. I think altogether I caught about 64 or 68 rats. And because the council wanted evidence of rats and so on and so forth, as I caught these, rather than throw them away, I had an old deep freezer in the garage so I could show them when they came up the kind of infestation that we had. And this is one that I kept for the council. Right, well, there we have one of Mr. Hall's best bred rats. And this is what we had to tolerate. On one occasion, when I had caught, I think 3 or 4 rats that day, continuously coming from the Hall side, I'd really had enough of this, and I threw one rat back into the Hall's garden, onto their grass.
While the battle with the rats continued, good news arrived when Mr. Hall was convicted after the knife fight on 2 counts of common assault.
He was found guilty on all counts. He was the one who came out and assaulted Ian, my friend, myself, and I feel that giving him 250 hours community work was a bit of an insult for, in my eyes, an attempted murder, because he'd been threatening to kill me for 23 months.
The Halls have now moved out of the house next door to Rod. They say they have never threatened Rod or called him a paedophile.
I think the Halls left, possibly living next door to a neighbour that they didn't get on with could be a contributing factor. I don't lose any sleep over it. I think because of my background that I've had far worse things than this, but it was just niggling. But I was thinking, thank God for that. I can have a little bit of peace now without being photographed, without being verbally abused. When they moved, then I thought, fantastic. I hope they move to the other side of the Pennines.
Coming up, Rod faces a new line of attack.
It says, "You still here, Scott? It's about bloody time that you off."
And in Brighton, it's the day of reckoning.
She was trespassing in my property. They should have arrested her, not me.
Don't forget about your chance to boost your bank account by a massive £10,000. You could take a family holiday or spruce up your home. It's completely up to you. To enter, call 0904 161 9955 or text WIN to 85545 or post your name and phone number to WIN, PO Box 7557, Derby DE1 0NP. For rules, go to channel5.com/win. In Brighton, relations between Wendy Attenborough and her upstairs neighbour George Brooker had reached an all-time low. An argument over who owned a small area of path had erupted into violence. And having reported Mr. Brooker for harassment, Wendy decided to take matters into her own hands.
The council wouldn't help me to get any proof, and I couldn't afford a CCTV camera myself, so I got a fake one. Cost me £5, and I put it on the wall on my side of the gate, and it just had a little flashing light. I mean, he probably knew it was fake, but he spray painted it.
Well, that was 99p in the pound 99p shop. She put it on the wall. If I'd have sprayed it, it wouldn't have made any difference, because it wasn't hiding anything at all, because it was only a 99p imitation, so it wasn't even a real camera. But I didn't spray it.
With paint on the camera and on her patio, Wendy felt the evidence against Mr. Brooker was mounting.
So I called the police and they came and they arrested him for criminal damage and harassment.
How can I harass her? Well, you tell me.
They took him off and they kept him in the cells overnight and apparently strip-searched him because he was being really aggressive to the police.
I was fingerprinted, DNA, the lot. And I stayed there for 9 hours on the lies she told. She was trespassing in my property. They should have arrested her, not me.
The next morning, Mr. Brooker was released without charge, but the argument still wasn't resolved.
There was a tiny bit of justice, but it just carried on. It just carried on. It didn't stop him.
6 months later, Wendy decided enough was enough.
When I moved out, I didn't tell anybody that I was moving. One day, the moving van came and I was gone. I still carry with me a lot of hurt and anger from what I was put through by Mr. Brooker, and it shouldn't happen to anybody else. And I really pity the new tenants.
Well, I'm quite happy she's moved because the fence is gone now. If that fence hadn't have gone up, there wouldn't have been no different. We would have still been bringing each other's bins in and one thing and another. We do it, the lady downstairs does it now, and I do it for her. I think I'm a good neighbour.
In Sheffield, Rod Scott and his 2 sets of neighbours had come to blows. The Halls, who lived next door, had moved out, but they'd left something behind.
The Halls moved and the new neighbour arrived, who I must say was a breath of fresh air, but he started to develop electrical problems. So I went round there and eventually we traced it. I lifted out the floorboards and the first thing we saw was a dead rat that was clamped onto the wire and quite dead. These were some of the rats that we took out from underneath the floor. And as far as I'm concerned, they have been cannibalised. The council came, the environmental people, and they witnessed all the evidence of the Hall's old house, and they confirmed that that was the source of the rats in the area.
Rod had freed mill houses of the rat plague, but the Halls still deny responsibility. Rod's other neighbours, who he'd been found guilty of harassing, then moved away too.
Did I breathe a sigh of relief? Well, I thought, well, this vindictiveness and maliciousness that I haven't really experienced in my life has now, hopefully, gone away.
But Rod's ordeal wasn't over. He had for some time been receiving a lot of mail and felt this wasn't a coincidence.
These coupons were being filled in my name, and as a result, I received about 2 meters of mail. It was all to do with aquability, paying for your funeral, invalid showers, mobility showers, but there were hundreds of these coming. I had no desire whatsoever to have any of this.
It wasn't just brochures for the elderly that were sent to Mr. Scott.
It says, "You still here, Scott? It's about bloody time that you off and move somewhere else. Convicted criminals like you shouldn't be living amongst decent people." I think these letters just tell you the story, that whoever is writing them is malicious, vindictive, and they've got a purpose in their sad little life to make my life a little uncomfortable.
The Halls have denied sending any letters, but Rod keeps a close eye on his neighbours and his post.
I feel that they won't stop, and I have no intention whatsoever of moving from this house.
Next time, a neighbourhood boundary dispute ends in battle.
My husband had blood all over his face and I thought he was dead.
There was blood everywhere. Blood was all over the place. I looked like something out of a horror picture.
A couple are terrified for their safety as life at home becomes a nightmare.
He just shouted at me, "Tell me where he is."
And a small dog starts a war.
quick!
The Eye in the Sky is spying trouble this week. Catch armed and dangerous caught on camera. That's new tomorrow at 8. Back to tonight, and there's no escaping this knock at the door. Can't pay? We'll take it away continues new, and right after a quick news update next.